So there's three directions the Knicks can go right now. One, you keep the status quo. You go into the playoffs with your mediocre starting lineup. This is a bad choice, in my opinion. That is not going to work out well. 1,700 possessions is not lying at this point. Two, you spend the remaining 28 games left trying to incorporate more Mitchell Robinson, trying to see, as he comes back, trying to see if a player of his level and his archetype significantly improves this lineup's performance. Or three, you spend the remaining 28 games trying to incorporate more Deuce McBride and see if a player at his level and his archetype significantly improves this lineup performance. This is so important, and I really believe this. I think it may single-handedly determine the Knicks' ceiling this season, which of these three options they choose. This is Hot Hand Theory. This is a podcast where we talk about the NBA and break things down from an analytical perspective. I'm your co-host, XJ. As always, he is my brilliant co-host, Geoff. Geoff, we have so much to talk about with the Knicks. We are at the All-Star break, 54 games into the Knicks season. Overall, I think it's undoubtedly been a great season for the Knicks, and we're at an excellent point to give our broad overarching perspectives on the season and let you guys know, the biggest things that we're seeing with the Knicks after, I think that's about 65% of the games have been played. We are moving through the season very quickly. But maybe let's start first by discussing their most recent stretch. They've been without OG Anunoby. They just had an injury to Deuce McBride. We are recording this on Thursday afternoon, so we're not sure the extent of that injury. So some of the great injury luck that they've had is at least starting to change. I would say not too badly. Like, those injuries are totally sustainable for the Knicks. What have you been seeing from their recent games, Geoff, especially the most recent Hawks game?
Yeah, I think, like you said, the vibes are mostly good, if not all good. I think that Knicks fans, if they were asked at the start of the season, if at the All-Star break they were going to have 36 wins and they were going to have won 2/3 of their games, I think every single Knicks fan would have signed up for that. So that's a really tough thing to, disregard or just remove from the equation. It's tough to be too critical when you know that they're ahead of where most people would have wanted them to be at this point. I think there are a lot of good things, and we'll touch on them. But I think the thing that most people are going to want to discuss is the defense. I think that's the topic that everyone's wondering. Do they need Mitchell Robinson to come back and play 30 minutes a game? Because that's the only way this defense is going to be adequate enough. Is the defense, even with Mitchell Robinson, is there a chance that that's not going to be good enough? And so I'm really excited to talk about this, because I think that there are some logical flaws that people are using when they discuss the defense. I think, per usual with us, it's going to come down to overall trade-offs. I think trade-offs are being ignored when they discuss the defense. They basically I shouldn't say they, that's a very general term, but a lot of people, when they discuss the defense, they view it as like this box that's being checked, like they need defense, and that's all they consider. It's not, if they do things to potentially improve the defense, what could they be losing? And is that worth it for the team on the net? Does that give them the best version of this team and the best chance of winning, 4 playoff series and ultimately a championship? So I think that's where we have to start, right? Like, is the overall defense, how it's been. They just gave up 148 points to a Hawks team that, let's be frank, this was one of the worst shooting teams I've ever seen, basically, like, at least in recent memory. They weren't even trying to put shooters out there. I mean, yeah, they had the benefit of having Niang as their backup big, and that's a huge boost to offenses. When you have a center who can stretch the court like that, that's almost like a cheat code for teams. LeVert's shooting is streaky, but he's a passable shooter. Obviously, Trae Young's a good shooter. That was pretty much it. That's what they had. They ran a starting lineup of Trae Young and 4 non-shooters. This should have been easy, in my opinion. I don't mean that disrespectfully to the Hawks. I actually think that the Hawks have a lot to build on right now. I just think it's too difficult without Jalen Johnson after having traded Bogdan Bogdanovic and DeAndre Hunter. I just think they're too limited outside of Trae Young right now. But I don't mean that in like a hateful or disparaging way. But I think for a Knicks team this talented, even without OG Anunoby, this should have been a lot easier than it made it look. And I have to pass a question back to you, XJ. What do you think? How do you think the Knicks can play a game like they played against the Celtics, where any person reviewing the film can tell you what's going on? They can, and we know the Knicks coach watches more film than any coach, self-proclaimed. We know that he's as good as any coach in the league at having his team prepared in certain areas. So I'm not at all, being accusatory here saying, oh, they're not watching the film, they're not prepared. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm curious about is how can they watch the film in a game like Boston, watch a guy like Luke Cornett have one of the most impactful defensive games you could ever see, and not like try to instill that into their own scheme? Because the Knicks are in the upper echelon in terms of teams that you're not going to be able to exploit. They play mostly shooters, and compared to the rest of the league, there are lineups that are way, way, way more infused with non-shooters and guys you can help off of, guys you can pre-rotate off of. And the Celtics found a way to even do it against the Knicks with Precious Achiuwa and Josh Hart on the court. So what I'm curious about is how the Knicks can't go from that game, watch that tape, and then be like, well, at bare minimum, we should be infusing these defensive principles against a team like the Hawks. Like, Trae Young should never be allowed to get an open shot, basically. That should be almost impossible. We should be able to funnel the ball to one of their non-shooters almost any possession. The amount of times Georges Niang slipped a screen and Trae Young got ahead of steam into the paint and then just found Niang one pass away, that should not be allowed when he has multiple shooters playing off him. So I know I just threw a lot at you, but I think that is the most frustrating thing from the perspective of the Knicks, is that they just seem to overly rely on their base scheme and strategy. And I know it's not the most comfortable thing for them, but it seems like they should be able to, when the opponent dictates it, move to a more switch-heavy scheme and a more exploitative scheme that people use against them.
It's a great point, and I'll definitely address that. I do want to say, just kind of, I don't know, to just recognize the situation of the fact that they were on a back-to-back. It is possible that it's hard to like really prepare for the Hawks team coming in the next day. And I think in general, over the years, and this is changing more in recent times, it's generally difficult to kind of prepare your team and have a different strategy for each team as you move forward throughout a season, especially if it's coming on a back-to-back. We see teams not exploit the Knicks having, Precious Achiuwa and Josh Hart on the court at the same time. And that's when we see those lineups kind of work pretty effectively. And then everybody's like, well, that lineup's great. Look at it. It's doing really well against Team A. And it's like, well, Team A didn't adjust to it at all. And then you play Team B, the Boston Celtics, and they're like, yeah, we're going to completely exploit this. We know exactly what to do. So there is varying degrees to which, teams are able to prepare for different schematic adjustments on a game-to-game basis. And I think it being a back-to-back actually matters. That being said, the fact that this is really confusing to me, because defensively it was actually perfectly set up, I believe, for Thibs, where Thibs really loves to, in my opinion, maybe this is a little bit reductive, but sell out to protect the rim. He tends to err towards protecting the rim. He doesn't want to give up rim attempts. He rather give up 3-point attempts, as we've seen from teams like the Boston Celtics, where in the first game of the season, where they were almost shattered every 3-point record known to the NBA community, that they'd rather give up 3-point attempts than give up like attacks on the rim. So even knowing that, it's extremely confusing to me, like how somehow they gave up 50% of the Hawks shots at the rim. That is in the first percentile in the NBA. Half of the Hawks shots were at the rim. I'm going to say some of that is affected by the fact that the Hawks had so many putback attempts and offensive rebounds because they were just missing shots because everybody on that team is really bad right now for the most part at not having Jalen Johnson, having moved on from DeAndre Hunter. But at the same time, that being said, isn't the whole point of having Precious about that not happening? Like them not getting a bunch of offensive rebounds and having a ton of putback attempts? Like, isn't that the whole idea? And isn't the whole idea that if you're packing the paint, you have more bodies to kind of box out and get rebounds? So it all ties in together, in my opinion. And I totally agree with you. It is bizarre to me. I did think the Knicks did some really good things in the game. So I want our audience to know that we're going to talk about that stuff. And I think there was a lot actually that was positive. But on the defensive end, that was jarring to me. Didn't make sense to me from a minimal effort. When you have Trae Young and 4 guys who shoot 30% from 3, there's no way they should be able to get to the rim. Like I don't, even if you don't change anything schematically, like there's just no way that should be able to happen. So I don't have a great answer for you of why that's happening other than maybe they weren't able to specifically hone in on and prepare for this team because of the back-to-back scenario. But beyond that, I don't have a great explanation.
Yeah, I think the most the most glass half full answer you can give is they're just not comfortable deploying those potential exploits without OG Anunoby. They just view OG as the Band-Aid per se, or as the guy to patch up mistakes. And the thing that bugs me is they're willing to send help from the perimeter down into the paint, but they do so at the most random times. And there doesn't seem to be any consistency to it. And it almost makes you wonder, like, do the players still not have the scheme figured out? Or are there still chemistry issues where, are the best teams, are the Boston Celtics of the world, the teams that just seem to so proficiently do these things? Is it just a matter of them not only being well coached, but also just having that chemistry and communication of knowing where the help's coming from? Because, sometimes no help will come and we'll see them get to the rim when it's like, okay, you can help off the shooter. And then other times they'll help off Niang one pass away in the corner. And it's like, no, that's not where you help. So it's, look, I understand these guys aren't, I understand these guys aren't robots. I get it. I'm not saying that they should just be able to mindlessly perform these tasks, but it's so far away from optimal right now, or at least it was in that Hawks game. And
here's what I'll say real quick to the points that you're making, because I think they're totally spot on. I do think there was just very sloppy play throughout by the players on the court. And there was the thing that Thibs is saying, don't take the All-Star break. Don't take a break before the All-Star break. It did seem to be some level of them taking a break before the All-Star break. There was terrible turnovers, bad rotations, missed box outs, bad gambles, like players like Josh Hart going for steals, giving up wide open dunks. Like there was a lot of very, very sloppy play throughout the entire game. So I have to imagine that there's some aspect of it of like taking a mental vacation already too early, like potentially.
So let's zoom out and think more about the defense in the macro then. Because, this Hawks game was its own thing. The Knicks escaped to the victory. That's the last time they play Atlanta in New York. It seems like they've played Atlanta at Madison Square Garden like 7 times this season.
Wait, real quick. Before we do that, because I want to go that direction. I do want to make sure we talk about some of the positive things from the Hawks game. So let's just touch. I just want to touch on a few things real quick before we go to the macro perspective, because when you and I talk macro, that's where the pod's going. So.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
I do want to say I really did appreciate about this game that they involved Trae in the action so much more, and it was night and day from the in-season tournament game or the NBA Cup game that they lost, where Trae was just able to chill on defense and was like almost like not involved at all. He was involved in almost everything. Like they were using Bridges as more of an initiator, like or like kind of an offensive hub at points when Trae was guarding him. There were guard screens that we rarely see with Brunson and Bridges, especially with having, Snyder having Trae hedge and recover. It was like terrible. Like, it was way too slow. The Knicks were getting really easy shots with involving Bridges into Brunson screens, more screens with Hart, involving Niang specifically in the action a ton. So I thought those were all really great things that they were doing very well. They were continue to leverage Towns' gravity extremely well. He's being more aggressive with his shooting. And there were some really good and encouraging plays with him at the top of the key, and Brunson and Bridges screening for one another to kind of get one of them going towards the rim, typically Bridges going towards the rim, and seeing good passes from Cat. So I thought those are all market improvements from the game in the NBA Cup that they played, which was, to me, I said this at the time, was the worst game of the season for the Knicks. And I know a lot of people disagree with that, but I think because we didn't see any of this, which made no sense, but now we saw all of it. So I think that's a market improvement, at least with their offensive approach, given that what we saw last time when they went against this Hawks team. So I just wanted to shout that out before we moved on from the game.
Yeah, I agree with almost all of that. I think their offensive approach was definitely better. I also think it's possible that our analysis is being slightly skewed by Karl-Anthony Towns and Jalen Brunson just being dynamos. The shot making from Towns, some of those threes he made, I don't know if that was a matter of them leveraging his gravity or them running good offense to get him shots. That was just him having infinite range from beyond the arc. And then truth of the matter is with Brunson, look, I do agree that they attacked Trae Young more, but I didn't see quite as much of the possession initiation from the guy that Trae was guarding. I thought they were more successful at getting Trae Young switched on to Brunson. There were way more of those possessions when Brunson was allowed to go to work onto Trae Young than I've seen, in past times. Whether it was the Knicks being better at getting him switched on, or it was the Hawks being worse at, scramming or pre-switching, whatever. I'm not 100% sure, but regardless of what it was, there were definitely more of those possessions where it's like, all right, Jalen's got Trae Young on him. It's time for him to go to work. I will say that there were still a shocking amount of those possessions where the spacing was just all messed up, and it's just like, all right, Jalen, good luck, and that's always the concern for me. Maybe I am miserable, because I just go right back to the negative. But no, I do think that that's like a general concern for me. I texted you on the side last night that Jalen being Jalen obviously is like the most important player on the Knicks. Obviously, he's going to get his jersey hung in the rafters, every positive accolade you could say. But you could make the argument that him being so good in these situations actually decentivizes the Knicks from making these changes that they probably should make. Like, there are just so many of these possessions where it's just like there's nowhere for anybody to go. Nobody could do anything in this space, and it's just on Brunson to make some ridiculous step back 20-footer that he's just better than most people at, or he draws a foul. Like, I don't know how many of these possessions Brunson makes mountains out of molehills, but he is just the king of that. And unfortunately, you come away from a game like that and you're like, oh, well, the spacing must not have been an issue. They scored 149 points in 53 minutes or whatever. So how could this be on the offense? And the issue there is that you're applying causation when there is no causation. The Knicks scored all those points in spite of they didn't score all those points because of the lack of space. They weren't boosted. They didn't score all those points because the rebounding helped them. They scored all those points for the most part because Jalen Brunson and Karl-Anthony Towns are two of the best offensive players in the league. Now, you could argue, and I'm going to steel man the dissenting perspective here, you could argue that Jalen Brunson and Karl-Anthony Towns will always be this talented, and therefore it is okay in the short term while OG Anunoby is out. If you're never going to be able to replicate what OG Anunoby has in terms of the combination of shooting and defense, you could make the argument that suppressing space while maintaining the size and rebounding and a facsimile of the defense that Precious Achiuwa gives you is justifiable. That there's no point in chasing the space because you're losing so much more on defense. So why not maintain the defense and rebounding from Precious and just say, all right, so we have a little bit less space, but Towns and Brunson, they've proven they can handle that. I think that is a reasonable argument. I'm open to that argument. But the only pushback I would give to it is I don't think they're preparing for anything come playoff time, because I still, and we saw it last season, we had these same exact conversations last season where XJ and I said, got to start Deuce. You got to start Deuce. These lineups could matter in the playoffs. This not only is their best lineup now, but these minutes could matter in the playoffs. And then they didn't start Deuce. The lineup was fine, but it wasn't as good as it was with Deuce, as we've pointed out these numbers many times. And then they got to the playoffs, and Precious Achiuwa is just unplayable at power forward, because the truth of the matter is he is unplayable at power forward when the other team is locked in and scheming against exploiting his weaknesses. So, tangent there. You didn't want to talk about the macro. You wanted to talk about how good Jalen Brunson was against the Hawks, and I found a way to rain on that parade. I apologize. I apologize to our listeners. I truly do. It's just how my brain works. It really is.
You do not need to apologize here, Geoff. This is what makes hot hand theory hot hand theory. There's only one hot hand theory, I'll say right now. That may be a good thing or a bad thing. I'm not sure, but I know there's only one of us, and so you gotta be yourself. And I obviously appreciate you having that macro thinking brain, because it is mine as well, or very similar. And I had to be like, no, let's zero in on what's happening right now in the micro. But speaking about this micro macro dynamic, I think it's a perfect segue to talk about one of your micro points, or points that appeared as a micro point. I think it's actually a macro point disguised as a micro point. I've said that both of those words a bunch of times. You dropped a post after the Hawks game, or I think maybe after the fourth quarter when it went into overtime, about something that you noticed about the game. You got some backlash, some support. Eventually, you were actually called out by John from Knicks Film School, who is a multi-time guest of the program, has been a hot hand theory multiple times. But he had some choice words for you after this tweet that you made. You said, Precious on the court for that final possession is one of those rare, quote-unquote, zero positive trade-off decisions. Legit sim to end autopilot coaching. We were bad in 2016, though, so it doesn't matter. A little snark there from you, but I think that it would be really helpful for you to expound on a question that some may have, which is why is this something you're focused on in particular in this super high scoring game that the Knicks pulled out a tough overtime win against, the Hawks when they were really sloppy the whole game, and there are a lot of things to comment on. Help us understand what you just said to me and what you just said to our audience about this is how your brain works, and this is how you're a macro thinker. We all know that by now. Help us understand why this is something that stands out to you, if you could talk about that a little bit.
A little snark is... That was nice of you. I just look here. So one thing,
it's Twitter, dude.
Yeah,
it's Twitter.
I mean, I'm just really bad at remembering that I'm speaking to people who don't know me. So I say things and I assume that like the overarching point that I'm trying to make is baked in, and then also I forget that nobody knows that I'm helping the Strickland account in-game, doing clips and tweets for there. So literally the only tweets I make during the games from my own account are probably the ones that I'm like, can't make that from Strickland. I don't want to present those as their views, So it really seems like 100% of the tweets that I make about the Knicks during these games are, negative or whatever, or just too over the top positive. They're basically polarizing. But with this one in particular, this is a decision that we've seen Thibs make multiple times. We saw it against the Bulls this year. You and I both got pushback when we said, why would Brunson be on the court for this last possession, defensive possession? And there's just no positives to him being on the court. Like, why would he be out there? This is just a mistake Thibs makes all the time. And for me, the frustration lies with the understanding that there's strong correlation between consistent mistakes like this and future bigger strategic mistakes. It's just not a one-off thing. It's not, he's got the strategy and the logical stuff figured out. He just happens to slip up here. He just forgets. These are decisions that correlate very, very strongly with other similar logic decisions. And so it's frustrating to me because, in my opinion, this should be a very simple decision. You have 2 seconds. There's no rebounding. There's maybe one screen being set, but Precious isn't even that great a screener. You want the most possible options and the most possible space. To me, that is obvious. It overrides every single other thing. And so I think when people see that, I break down that last possession like that, they are correctly, and I'm empathetic to their perspective because I get that they're fans and I get that they're just trying to enjoy this team that is winning 2/3 of its game and probably is the closest to a championship contender we've seen in 30 years. They're just like, shit, man, just enjoy the game. Like I'm very empathetic to that. But to me, what I see is a mistake that is likely to compound or carry over in bigger, more important moments. And so that's where I'm coming from. That's why I'm maybe more frustrated about that singular decision than other people seem to be. And yeah, that's just my overall perspective on it. I didn't think it was that crazy.
Yeah, I appreciate that breakdown, and that's exactly what I was thinking when I see that. Obviously, I know you very well, so it all adds up to me pretty quickly in that you're looking at this one decision, but not from a micro lens of like, this is the most important thing of the game, but this is a decision that reflects a continuous kind of non-ideal kind of approach or decision making that could affect and likely will affect the Knicks' ability to win in the margins, which is extremely necessary in the playoffs. We're talking about 7-game series that often go 7 games between evenly matched teams, sometimes teams that are better than your team, and you have to win in the margins. You have to be like a Chris Paul, where it's like, no, we're going to fight for every single thing, every single inch that we can get, because at the end of this game, at the end of this series, it may be decided by 2 inches. And so those 2 inches that we scrapped and clawed for that seemed insignificant, those actually determine the difference of the series and who won and who moved on. And oftentimes we see that closeness in terms of level, talent, energy expenditure, all of those things in the playoffs. And so those decision-making things that are really, really critical to determining who's going to win at the end of a series, those really stick out to you, and they do to me as well. So I totally understand. I appreciate you sharing that perspective. And I think it's important to have people like you and us like in the space who are thinking about those things, because some are just thinking about the joy of the moment. And I think that's valid. They should talk about that. Some who are thinking about, micro decisions, some who are thinking about tactical decisions in terms of play calls and the way that the offense or the defense is being run schematically, and they talk about that in a micro way. And there are people like us who are really macro thinkers, and that's kind of what we provide to the space. So I think it's totally valid. Hopefully our audience appreciates it. I always feel like we're kind of having this macro conversation about ourselves in terms of how we think through the game, but I think it's good. I think it's good to explain this is the perspective that we're coming from. And so I think it's helpful for you to lay that out for sure.
Yeah. And just it's more important to hold a microscope against yourself and your views than anybody else. We have to always be putting our opinions, our perspectives almost on trial and making sure that, like, why would people listen to this if we weren't constantly evaluating and evolving our methodologies of thinking and just the way we address the game? We wouldn't be worth listening to if we had the same opinions and we didn't learn anything from this season, or we weren't trying to improve our evaluations. Eventually it would just be like, oh, they're saying the same things they were saying 2 years ago. No, we're trying to learn just like anybody else. But with the exact example that we're talking about here, it's sort of similar to the lineup stuff. It's why we both harp on the lineup stuff so much, and maybe why we're misunderstood about the lineup stuff so much, because we talk about, to bring it back to Precious at power forward, anytime they play well, we get, shit, and where it's like, oh, you didn't look, they're playing well, and you didn't see. And it's like, it's such a misunderstanding of what we're trying to say. We're not saying that this lineup with Precious at the power forward can never play well. We're not even saying it's theoretically a bad lineup in a total vacuum when considering all the opponents. We're just saying it's not the best lineup. And we're worried about playing the best lineups because when push comes to shove, this team can't win not playing its best lineups. You have to win at the margin. You have to play the best lineups. And against a team like the Hawks, against a team like the Raptors, against a team like the Rockets without Şengün and Van Vliet, sure, you can get away with not winning at the margins, with playing your second best lineup or your third best lineup instead of your best lineup. But then you play the Celtics and you try to play the first half, 19 minutes of the first half, with this one lineup that like very clearly is not your peak ceiling lineup, and you get slammed. And this is the concern for me. The concern for me that there's no thought or very little thought, it's low on the totem pole of how do we maximize this version of the team. That for me is all I'm concerned about, always concerned about, is trying to make sure that this team, which we have from day one, probably more than any other people evaluating the Knicks, have said we believe can win a championship this season. It's built to win a championship. It's built to compete with Boston, but they can't compete with Boston if they don't play the best, if they're not the best versions of themselves. And, you know, if I was grading this season through 2/3 of the season, I would give it an A+ based on the absolute results, because how could you complain about 36-18? You can't. Like, that is an elite start, and sure, they're the third seed, but they're the third seed because the Cavs have blown the doors off of any expectations anybody's had for them, and OKC and Boston are elite. Like, that's fine. Every single Knicks fan, Knicks content creator, Knicks analyst would have been like, yeah, maybe not in OKC and Boston's tier, but right below them. They can give them a push this season. So give them an A, give them an A+, whatever you want to give them. They've been great so far this season. Inconsistent, but still on the whole great. But if I had to grade them in terms of how likely I think it is that they hit their ceiling in the playoffs, that they really give a team like Boston, if Boston's healthy, a push, I would incomplete or not good. They're still not doing these things that correlate with hunting the ceiling that we talk about all the time. And, you know, long ramble ending here, that is always our goal.
I think that was beautifully put. And we didn't talk about this at all for everybody listening. We did not plan this at all, but this is exactly the conversation that I wanted to have, at least from a macro perspective coming into this pod. I just really want to focus. I mean, it makes sense. We're at the All-Star break. Like I said, about 65% into the season, 54 games into the season. Playoff time is going to be here before we know it. There's like 30% of the season left, obviously, to me. And based on what Geoff just said, it sounds like he agrees. There's a very glaring observation and conversation that needs to be had. And I want to start by saying, you talk about lineups a lot. Lineup data can be really tricky because it takes a large sample of possessions in order to stabilize. And when I say stabilize, I just mean for things basically to like shake out to where we can expect a similar result as we're seeing moving forward. Because you have to account for like luck factors, hot and cold streaks, playing different offenses and defenses in the league, playing different levels of teams in the league, bad teams and good teams and great teams and terrible teams. Generally around 500 possessions of a 5-man group is when we can start to say, okay, this seems pretty reflective of who this group is. This is kind of how they perform. Around 700 possessions is when we can start to feel much more confident about it. Like, this seems very solid. The Knicks starting lineup, including OG Anunoby, Jalen Brunson, Josh Hart, Mikal Bridges, OG Anunoby, Karl-Anthony Towns, that lineup has now played 1,639 possessions together. Remember, I said about 500 we can kind of get a sense, 700 we can be confident. They played over double the 700 number. They've played that number of possessions together, and they have a differential of plus 5.9 per 100 non-garbage time minutes possessions, according to Clean the Glass. That might sound good, plus 5.9. This is actually 54th percentile in the league. That is absolutely a mediocre lineup at nearly 1,700 possessions in at this point of the season. So what that means from like just like a data perspective, for all intents and purposes, it means we can be extremely confident that this is who this starting lineup is, and something significant would have to change for us to see any level of consistent overperformance above this baseline. So unless there's some particular reason we're not aware of, like an injury or something like that, why someone's performing poorly and sort of, sandbagging the lineup to some extent, unless there's something like that, 1,700 possessions is, we know what it is. This is what the lineup is. It is a mediocre lineup, 54th percentile in the league. I also want to clarify something. A lot of people I know talk about, how good the Knicks offense has been. And I agree, it's been great this season overall. They're 90th percentile offense overall in the league. But that starting lineup that I mentioned is only 66th percentile in offense in the league among all 5-man groupings. Only a little bit above average. And you would not think this, given how, the Knicks are the third best offense and they're dominating and they're breaking all kinds of all-time records. And, obviously offense is always getting better. So that makes sense. That specific grouping is 66th percentile in offense. Again, for this to change, something significant would need to happen. I need to stress that so much. Like, we've seen the best of Jalen Brunson. We've seen the best of Karl-Anthony Towns. We've seen the best of Josh Hart. This is the best season of his entire career. We've seen the best of OG and Mikal more sporadically. So to me, it's either you have to have Mikal or OG suddenly get much, much better and much more consistent, or you have to see some significant schematic change on defense as well as offense, because again, that offense is not going to get it done, honestly. 66th percentile offense for that lineup is not going to get it done. And by the way, the Knicks' second most played lineup is the starting lineup with Precious in for OG, and that we've seen just been starting since OG has gotten hurt. That's at 235 possessions. It's almost exactly the same as the starting lineup at +6 per 100. Nothing's different. Nothing's different about it. It's the same. And it's obviously a smaller sample. I would expect it to actually be worse over a larger sample. But giving this information, this is a mediocre most played lineup. We can be confident in that. This is the most confidence we can possibly have at this point in the season. And that's very concerning for, as you've been alluding to, Geoff, for a playoff environment where you're relying on your main lineup even more than you do in the regular season. So there's 3 directions the Knicks can go right now. 1, you keep the status quo. You go into the playoffs with your mediocre starting lineup. This is a bad choice, in my opinion. That is not going to work out well. 1,700 possessions is not lying at this point. 2, you spend the remaining 28 games left trying to incorporate more Mitchell Robinson, trying to see, as he comes back, trying to see if a player of his level and his archetype significantly improves this lineup's performance, pending his health. Or 3, you spend the remaining 28 games trying to incorporate more Deuce McBride and see if a player at his level and his archetype significantly improves this lineup performance, pending his health, of course, again. So our audience knows what option I would choose at this point. Yeah, but to me, it's so important. This is so important. And I really believe this. I think it may single-handedly determine the Knicks' ceiling this season, which of these 3 options they choose. And these are the 3 options that they have for sure, unless you can think of other ones, Geoff, or anybody in the audience. If you could think of other ones, drop a comment. I'd love to see. Maybe I'm missing something. But I just think this is so critical, and it is not being talked about enough as the fact that we've seen what this lineup is, and it's not going to change. Something else must change, because a 54th percentile most played lineup that is primarily playing so many minutes together during the playoffs will not win a championship. And that doesn't mean the Knicks couldn't win a championship. It means the way that they're being deployed won't win a championship.
Yeah, that was so good. And I think that an important thing to add on to this is, because it always seems like Josh Hart is like the odd man out, but you can build. This afternoon, somebody asked me, what would your rotation be? How would you do it? What would you do? How would you run this team if you were given the keys? What was your rotation? And I built a rotation that was very, very logical and easy, just with Deuce starting, that had Josh Hart getting 38 minutes. I don't even think either one of us, with how Josh Hart's playing now, thinks Josh Hart should play like any less. I don't even know if that's justified. He's been amazing this year. Like he's been absolutely amazing. He's shooting, for the most part, the open shots. Like, I know he's not actually shooting from a volume perspective, as he's shooting basically the same amount of threes as he did last year. But if you just watch the games, I feel like there are far fewer, I got the ball and I'm open and I'm just not going to shoot. I think he's shooting when he's being left open. He's just being left open less. And that means that whether it's his rebounding or it was the short-term results to start the season, the passive impact has actually been better, because it means his defenders are being tied to him more. And I think the rebounding part is especially noticeable, because anytime a team tries to play off him or ignore him, he uses that as like a springboard to come flying in and grab the offensive rebound. I do think that does help the offense. But I think that there are ways to make sure that a higher percentage of his minutes actually come on the wing, make him play 3 or 4 and just no shooting guard. And by starting Deuce, you raise his minutes floor to like 30 to 32 minutes. I think there's a very easy path to having a playoff rotation where Brunson plays 38 minutes, Bridges plays 38 minutes, Hart plays 38 minutes, OG plays 36 minutes, Towns plays like 34, 35 minutes, Deuce plays 32 minutes, and then you just have Payne and Mitch or Precious to spill in. Payne gets the 10 or so backup Brunson minutes when Brunson sits at point guard, and you have Precious or Mitch in for Towns in those few minutes that Towns sits, and that's it. That's your playoff rotation. I think the good thing about that is because Thibs correctly loves Josh Hart, when he's coming off the bench, Hart's versatility will be more emphasized. And this is something I thought a lot during the Boston game so much because the Knicks came out of out of halftime down whatever they were down 19, and their one adjustment was, all right, let's try to get some energy, let's infuse shooting to open the half. We're going to start Deuce and let's see how that goes. And it took Joe Mazzulla about 4 minutes to make an adjustment. But that was all the Knicks had. The thing is that when you play one single lineup as frequently as the Knicks play their most popular lineup, it's so much easier to adjust because you don't have as many moves. Playoffs are all about punches and counter punches. And when you have a Swiss Army knife like Josh Hart, if he's coming off the bench and 1 minute he's playing power forward for OG Anunoby, and then you're putting OG Anunoby back in for Mikal Bridges and you're emphasizing his strengths, and then you're taking Deuce McBride out and you have the three of them on the court all together, Joe Mazzulla can't just baseline be like, oh, I'm just going to deploy this one exploit across the board because you're playing 3 different lineups. This is huge. This is exactly how you beat a team like Boston. But if you just say, yeah, this is the only lineup I trust, and I'm just going to play in the first 10 minutes of the quarter, every single good coach is going to have that scouted and going to have that maximally exploited. Whether that means they're +5 per 100 or that goes down in the playoffs, I don't know. But I know that it's easier to prepare for a team who has minimal lineup versatility. So when XJ and I talk about this, one of the things we are talking about, or maybe I shouldn't speak for you, XJ, but what I'm talking about isn't even so much about nailing, like thinking Deuce is better than Hart or thinking that the net will be better with Deuce on because of shooting. I do think that, but I think it's even more important to get this lineup versatility and make sure that across their most important 6 guys, which is the current starters and Deuce McBride, all 6 are playing 30 to 40 minutes, and you're getting a bunch of combinations of all 6 of those guys.
Yeah, I think that was totally spot on, especially about, kind of the way that you beat some of these coaches who are able to adjust on the fly so quickly. You kind of have to keep them guessing and keep throwing different things at them. And I also want to add a couple things on Josh Hart, because you mentioned how good he's been. And obviously, I think we both, and you especially, get a lot of slack about like not liking Josh Hart. Josh Hart has been incredible this season. Josh Hart has been a sub all-star for sure, like close to an all-star. He's easily having the best year of his career. But I think it is totally relevant. 2 things I want to say. Actually, I'll say this one first. The best lineup that the Knicks have had over 100 possessions includes Josh Hart. The second best lineup doesn't include Josh Hart. The third best lineup includes Josh Hart. The fourth best lineup includes Josh Hart. Do you want to know who else it includes? Deuce McBride, Deuce McBride, Deuce McBride, Deuce McBride. So this is not necessarily just about Josh Hart. This is about what Deuce McBride offers to serve as the offensive lubricant, as one might say, in these lineups offensively and defensively. Because again, I think one of the things that we saw that was negative in the Hawks game that we already talked about was Mikal Bridges' defense on the ball against Trae Young was not good. Trae Young is the second time this season completely roasts Mikal Bridges. He cannot keep him in front. That's why Trae Young was at the rim all day and even missed a couple layups early in the game in the first quarter, despite blowing past Mikal Bridges. And I don't think that's a flaw with Mikal Bridges' defense overall, because I think he's been excellent defensively overall, especially on wings. I think it's an issue with point of attack defense against small, quick guards. You know who's great at that? Deuce McBride. That's someone who is one of the best, if not the best screen navigator in the entire league. This is not a one-sided thing. I think the offense will absolutely be better with Deuce McBride shooting on the court, regardless of cold stretches that he may have had throughout the season, still shooting nearly 50% on wide open threes. That is going to have an impact. There is no way to leave Deuce McBride open no matter what is happening. And so that will have an impact on offense, but I don't think it's going to have this negative, horrible impact on defense. I really don't. And I honestly just think that even if you change things schematically on defense, the data suggests that is not going to be enough. People call this out as a depth issue. Depth would not fix this, especially in the playoffs, like we said, where your main guys are playing even more than they are now. Josh Hart played 42 minutes per game in the playoffs last season. If you think he's playing 38 or a minute less than 40 this coming playoff season, you have another thing coming. He's going to play that much. So it is, to me, about trying these other lineups and trying to find your best one, your most effective one that you can go to, not one that's been mediocre for 1,700 possessions. And so to me, this is just something that they have to do moving forward, or this will come and bite them back. If you're not willing to try Deuce, you have to try with Mitch, because while I don't think that's going to be the most effective, you have to try it, because this can't be your primary lineup that you play, throughout the postseason, expecting a 54th percentile lineup to defeat the top 4 teams or the top 3 teams in the Eastern Conference that you go against. It doesn't make sense.
I have a question for you. Let's say the Knicks inserted Deuce McBride into the starting lineup first game after the All-Star break, and he finished the season. Who do you think would be most positively impacted of the other starters? Because I have an answer, but I'm curious who you think it would be.
Which individual starter on the Knicks? You mean if he was inserted for Josh Hart?
Correct.
I mean, I would have to say Jalen Brunson probably, but I can imagine. I mean, I think they'll all be impacted very positively. Who are you thinking?
I think it'd be Towns. I think Jalen's impact would go up.
That's fair.
My answer is Towns, because I think what Towns is doing so far this year, almost more than Brunson, is immaculate. And the reason I think that is because Towns is shooting, what is he? Is he still shooting 45% from 3? He's shooting something absurd.
It's like 43, I think.
Yeah, he's shooting 44% from 3, 46% from the mid-range. But the shot diet that he's shooting on, it's so infrequent that a team these days will either let Towns and Brunson run pick and pop and let Towns just walk into an open 3, or have Jalen Brunson create an advantage and the ball swings around and Towns finds himself with an open 3. You watch games where Towns played center back on the Timberwolves last year when Rudy Gobert wasn't on the court and he was sharing the court with Naz Reid. This was something that happened all the time when he was surrounded by 5 shooters. I think when we talk about this passive impact and we talk about what you can do when the ball doesn't touch your hands, I think the difference in how defenders will treat Deuce McBride and how they'll stay tied to him will lead to more advantages created by Jalen Brunson, but also lead to more of those swings where Towns' 3-point shot diet looks even better, which is interesting. Again, it's going to sound funny to people because he's shooting 44%, but this reminds me of Dante DiVincenzo last year when DiVincenzo was shooting whatever he was shooting, and it was just like, yeah, this would be remarkable shooting if it was just on its own. But what was he last year? I mean, I remember we made a short about it, but his shot quality was like in the 5th percentile or something, right? Or wasn't it like an F shot quality?
Yeah, it was bad. Yeah.
Yeah. He basically was shooting only impossible deep threes, contested threes, and he was making them all. And like, this is what Towns is doing. I think Towns will get more in rhythm looks. I think he'll get cleaner line drives to the rim rather than, the ball swings to him and he gets a line drive to the rim, but hey, there's a second guy waiting for him at the rim. I think that's harder. I think he'll get easier kickouts if they do stunt on his drives. I think everything will just become easier when the space that was promised to him comes to fruition. So look, this is simplistic analysis. You look at Towns' offensive impact and you compare per using dunks and threes EPM, and you compare it to all the other seasons he played center before Rudy Gobert got to Minnesota, this would be the worst season per EPM of Karl-Anthony Towns' career since his rookie year. So, And that's with shooting 44% from three. Shooting is the strongest correlation to impact. He's shooting 44% from three, and you have this metric that's still saying, yeah, I mean, he's just not as good as he once was. Why is that? Is it because the volume relative to the rest of the league is down? Yeah, probably. He's shooting, his 3-point attempts are as low as they've been since 2019. He's not getting a lot of those open threes because there are guys to help off of. He's not going to get threes against Boston. If this lineup, that is going to be the most jarring thing against Boston. If they play Boston in the second round and this starting lineup maintains, the 3-point numbers will be suppressed, and the Knicks will have to have an even harder time winning that series because they're just going to have to God mode from like the mid-range. Those are the only shots Joe Mazzulla will allow. Karl-Anthony Towns will not get open threes against that team. That just won't happen. He'll have to take contested threes, and he'll have to take mid-range and rim attempts. Those are the shots he's going to get. Jalen Brunson also will not be able to step into pull-up threes. He will have to take contested threes and lots of tough mid-range attempts against elite defenders. Those are the things they will have to deal with this lineup. I think that with Deuce McBride in the lineup, that will be slightly different. I don't think they will as aggressively help off of Deuce McBride. And again, as we talked about multiple times in this podcast, that is a margin that could make or break a series against the Boston Celtics.
I think that's an excellent point. I could totally see Towns being the one who benefits most, and something that you didn't mention that I think he could also benefit with is when he is sort of orchestrating the offense from above the break or the top of the key in many cases. Like I said, they're adding in some really fun stuff with him where, you know, they'll have the two wings, like a wing or a wing and somebody in the corner kind of screen for each other and have one of them go to the rim. And Towns is really able to make those passes extremely well. The problem has been that they're doing that, and then whoever's guarding Precious in the other corner is just sitting in the paint waiting for them. And it's been really effective if that wouldn't be the case. And if Deuce McBride is in the corner instead of Precious Achiuwa, that player is not going to be sitting in the paint waiting for a cutting Mikal Bridges. So I think there are other ways where that insertion will really improve the offense. And make no mistake, like I said, this is a 66 percentile offense with the starting lineup, over 1,700 possessions. That is not good enough. That is not good enough. Something that we do know is that Jalen Brunson, Towns, and Deuce McBride, those three-man pairings or groupings are plus 17 points per 100 over 381 possessions. The same Brunson, Towns, and substitute McBride for Hart is 9 points per 100 worse over 2,300 possessions. So all I'm saying is you have to use this time that you have remaining in the season to try some of this stuff. And honestly, Geoff, obviously, we could just be wrong. They could play Deuce McBride and they could get destroyed on the boards. His point of attack defense falters. He doesn't make shots. Teams don't respect him. The impact of his shooting and gravity of his shooting is not what we anticipate it to be. And it doesn't go well, and that's okay. But the only way to find that out, if every sample that you've had up until now, it's dominant. Like every single time you've given it an opportunity, it's not just winning the minutes. It's not just winning the minutes by a lot. It's not just outperforming the starting lineup. It is dominating the minutes and the possessions that they play it. So it could be wrong. Play it for 500 possessions and then find out, because you need to do that before the playoffs start if you want a chance of actually winning a title this season. And people not saying this is just a lost season anyway, and so it didn't matter. None of it mattered anyway, and we're just going into next season with somehow miraculously going to get better without changing any of the main stars that they have on the team. And some depth piece that is their sixth man or seventh man is going to somehow change the fortunes of the team next season, which is not going to happen. So I just think this is something that has to happen. So that's pretty much it for me. I don't really have anything else to add. Do you have any more thoughts that you want to jump in with?
I just want to reiterate we could be wrong. This is why, to me, it was so important to start Deuce from day one, because there was no question about who Thibs' favorite player on the team is. That's Josh Hart, the guy who he trusts arguably the most in terms of playing heavy minutes, the guy who he trusts at multiple positions. If player X is out of power forward, just put Hart there. Small forward, shooting guard. There was no question about if Josh Hart came off the bench, oh no, he might play only 18 minutes a game. That thought never went into my mind. So again, like this idea that because we want maybe Josh Hart to come off the bench in the short term The whole goal is you can keep fudging with this lineup that we've seen play 1,700 possessions. That was still going to play a bunch anyways, folks. It was always going to get time. And I said this from before the season started, that if Josh Hart started, the lineup with Deuce McBride wouldn't play. It just wouldn't play because of how Thibs substitutes and because of how most of his bench players get treated and how they're just seen as guys who are in there to supplant the starters for a little bit until the starters are ready to go back in. The one exception to this rule would have been Josh Hart. Josh Hart would have been the exception. He would have still played 30 to 35 minutes as he should have, and we would have gotten a large sample of both the Deuce lineup and the Josh Hart lineup with this starting. It would have been more balanced. It would have been, we could directly compare them in the minutes they're playing, and yeah, we now have a better feel for which one's better. Instead, we're flying blind, and we're going to keep flying blind until something changes.
Yep, I think that's well said. The actual last thing I was going to say is I would just feel more, again, I told you what the three options are. I would feel better if they tried, Mitchell Robinson in the starting lineup than if they just went with the status quo, because I think, again, we've just seen enough of the lineup to know that this is not going to be at the level that it needs to be to win 4 series in a playoff environment. And so, if they do hope to win a championship this year, they have to try something. Well, I appreciate everybody for being with us, and it was an action-packed episode. So if you're still here at this point, then that means you probably enjoy at least a little bit of how we analyze the game and what we have to offer. Leave a comment. We just recently crossed the 2,000 subscriber threshold, which we entirely forgot to celebrate. So that's really dope, and thank you guys so much. I appreciate it. But if you're still here, why don't you listen to our next episode, which is dropping, I think, on Monday. Just appreciate your support. For Geoff, I'm XJ, and this has been Hot Hand Theory.